One minute, he was just waiting for his luggage. The next, he was being treated like a suspect. But this officer, he picked the wrong man to mess with. Los Angeles International Airport was its usual chaos. Gate changes blaring over the intercom, kids crying, business travelers glued to their phones, exhausted vacationers dragging their suitcases behind them. Omari Kasim had just stepped off a 5-hour flight from Dallas. He stretched, a little stiff from the long trip, but relieved to be back in California. He wasn't the type to complain. Life was good. At 38, he was the co-founder of a fast-growing tech firm, specializing in cybersecurity, a name people in the industry were starting to recognize. But here, he was just another traveler, blending into the crowd, or at least, that's what he thought. Then, he noticed him. A cop, standing near the entrance to baggage claim, arms crossed, eyes locked on Omari, Officer Grant Kearney, late 40s, stocky building standard TSA law enforcement uniform. Nothing unusual, except the way he stared, like he was waiting for Omari to make a wrong move. Omari had seen this before, too many times. He checked his phone, looked away. Maybe he was imagining it. Maybe Kearney was looking past him. But when he reached the baggage carousel, he glanced up again. Kearney was still there, watching. Not the guy in the wrinkled suit next to him, not the teenagers goofing off, their backpacks half open, not the man pacing in cargo shorts ranting into his AirPods. Just him. Omari exhaled, shaking his head. He knew what this was. It wasn't the first time. It wouldn't be the last. But then, Kearney moved, straight toward him. Omari's grip tightened around his carry-on handle as the officer stopped a few feet away, too close for a casual conversation. "Can I see some identification?" Kearney's voice was clipped, official. Omari blinked. "Excuse me?" Kearney's eyes narrowed. "I need to see your ID." "For what?" "You've been standing here for a while." Omari let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "So is everybody else. We're all waiting for bags." Kearney's face didn't change. "Just show me your ID." Now, Omari had a choice. He could hand over his ID, let this officer flex his authority, or he could push back. Omari tucked his phone into his pocket. "Is there a reason you're asking me? And nobody else?" Kearney's jaw tensed. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for." Ah, there it was. Omari crossed his arms. "And what description is that?" Silence. Then, "We can do this the easy way, or the hard way." "The hard way, right? Because asking a question is resisting?" Omari wasn't stupid. He knew how this could go. Push too hard, things could turn ugly. Stay silent, and Kearney walks away, thinking he can do this again. To someone else. How far was Kearney willing to take this? Before Omari could decide, someone else did. A voice cut through the tension. "Excuse me, officer. Is there a problem here?" Omari turned. A woman in a dark green blazer stood a few feet away, phone raised. And, just like that, everything shifted. For a split second, Kearney hesitated. His gaze flickered toward the woman with the phone. Omari recognized her immediately. Miriam Cho, award-winning journalist, investigative reporter, and the last person any cop wanted recording them. She didn't lower her phone. "I'm just making sure everything's handled fairly here." Her voice was calm, but firm. Kearney exhaled sharply like an annoying fly had just buzzed into his space. He turned back to Omari. Irritated now. "Sir, I'm asking you one last time. Show me your ID." Omari held his ground. "You still haven't told me why," he said, keeping his voice steady. "And if I really fit a description, you should have no problem explaining what that is." The energy in the terminal shifted. The background noise, the hum of conveyor belts, rolling suitcases, distant chatter, faded under the weight of growing silence. People were noticing. A middle-aged black man in a navy hoodie, A young woman with bright red headphones slung around her neck. A white couple near the baggage carousel. Eyes turning toward the scene. Some discreetly pulled out their phones. Kearney felt it. His fingers twitched at his belt, near his radio. He had a choice now. Back down or escalate. His ego wouldn't let him pick the first. He reached for Omari's wrist. "All right, turn around." Omari stepped back, hands raised slightly, not aggressive, but clear. "You're trying to detain me? For what crime?" Then, Miriam's voice cut through the tension. "You might want to reconsider that, officer." A pause. "You have about 6 cameras on you right now." Kearney's head snapped toward her. His face shifted, from authority to irritation. "Ma'am, this is a law enforcement matter. Stay out of it." Miriam didn't blink. It became a public matter the second you singled him out, without cause. More voices now, not loud, but enough. A woman nearby. "Yeah, why is he the only one being questioned?" A young guy muttered, "I saw the whole thing. He was just standing here." Kearney's face tightened. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Usually, when he exerted control, people complied. They lowered their heads, answered his questions, showed their papers, made it easier for themselves. But not today. Omari saw it in his eyes, the realization sinking in. Kearney had miscalculated. And then, a new voice entered the scene. Firm, authoritative. "Officer Kearney?" Kearney turned. So did Omari. A man in a gray blazer, an airport security badge clipped to his chest, strode toward them. Rodney Finch, airport security director. A name Omari recognized, though they'd never met in person. Finch's sharp gaze moved from Kearney's stiff posture to Omari's composed but tense stance, then to the small crowd gathering, phones still recording. He understood the situation immediately. His gaze hardened. What exactly is going on here? And just like that, the table started to turn. The air crackled with tension, thick enough to choke on. Kearney stiffened, jaw tight. He shifted his weight, glancing at the cameras. He knew Finch outranked him in this setting, but the frustration burning beneath his skin was hard to contain. Omari, on the other hand, remained still. Calm. He wasn't going to gloat, wasn't going to smirk, because this wasn't over. Not yet. Finch's eyes locked onto Kearney. "I asked you a question, Kearney. What's the issue here?" A pause. Kearney hesitated. He knew how this looked. But backing down, not an option. "This individual was acting suspiciously," he said, voice clipped. He was lingering near baggage claim, and when asked for identification, he refused to comply. Omari let out a slow breath through his nose. "I refused because you singled me out for no reason. I was standing here, just like everyone else, waiting for my bag." Finch's expression darkened. He'd been in airport security long enough to know when a situation had gone sideways. And this was bad. He turned to Omari. "Sir, I apologize for any inconvenience. Are you waiting for a checked bag?" Omari nodded once. "Yes." "Do you have your baggage tag?" Without a word, Omari pulled out his phone, scrolled to the digital copy of his baggage receipt, held it up. Finch glanced at it, then turned to Kearney. His tone was dangerously even. "Did you ask for this?" Kearney's nostrils flared. "I asked for ID." Finch's stare hardened. "Did you ask for his baggage claim receipt?" Silence. Kearney didn't answer, because they both knew the truth. Finch exhaled sharply, turned back to Omari. "You're free to collect your bag, sir." A beat. "I appreciate your patience." Omari could have left it at that. He could have just taken the out and walked away. But something in him refused. "This keeps happening," he said, his voice quieter now, but somehow heavier. "And the worst part? Guys like him never think twice about it." A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. Finch nodded slowly. I understand your frustration. Omari met his gaze, steady, unblinking. No, you don't. A pause. But you could try. Silence. Kearney's face burned red, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. Omari wasn't looking for an apology, not from him. Instead, he glanced at Miriam. Her phone was still recording. Do you have everything you need? She gave a slow, knowing nod. Kearney felt it now, the weight of real consequences. The public eye was on him. And in this era, that mattered more than a badge. Finch exhaled through his nose, chose his next words carefully. I'll be reviewing the footage, Officer Kearney. We'll have a conversation later. Omari didn't gloat. He didn't need to. The shift had already happened, and Kearney knew it. He stood stiff as a board, his face a shade darker. Whether from anger or realization, it didn't matter. He had lost control, and he knew it. But letting go, that wasn't in his nature. You're making a mistake, Kearney muttered under his breath, barely loud enough for Finch to hear. Finch didn't flinch. His expression didn't change. The only mistake I see is an officer using his badge to harass someone who is minding his business. A few people in the crowd murmured in agreement. A woman whispered something to her friend, shaking her head. Someone else let out a low, disapproving whistle. Omari had seen moments like this before, but he'd never been on this side of it. Usually, the system protected its own. Not today. Miriam stepped forward, lowering her phone slightly, but still recording. Officer Kearney, do you have a statement you'd like to make? For the record. The way his head snapped toward her, she might as well have slapped him. His hands curled into fists at his sides, his mouth opened, then closed, his jaw flexed. But what could he say? Anything that came out of his mouth could and would be used against him. Finch didn't let the silence drag. Kearney, you're dismissed. Report to my office after your shift. Omari saw it. The battle waging inside Kearney, pride against reality, control versus consequence. For a second, Omari wondered if he'd push back, dig his heels in, make things worse. But he didn't. Kearney took a slow step back, then another. His eyes flickered to Omari. Something flashed through them. Resentment. Recognition. Omari held his gaze, not in anger, not even in triumph, just understanding. Because this moment, it would stay with Kearney longer than it would stay with him, and without another word, Kearney turned and walked away. The second he was gone, the air shifted. Someone let out a breath they'd been holding. A man in a plaid shirt chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. A woman in a leather jacket muttered, "About time." And just like that, the crowd began to scatter. Omari rolled his shoulders, exhaled slowly. The tension that had gripped him for the last 10 minutes finally started to ease. Miriam stepped closer. You okay? Omari gave a small, tired nod. Yeah. You handled that well. Omari exhaled, voice even. I shouldn't have had to handle it at all. Miriam pressed her lips together. Didn't disagree. Finch cleared his throat. Mr. Kasim, again, I sincerely apologize. If you'd like to file a complaint, I'd be happy to assist. Omari shook his head. No need. Finch blinked, clearly surprised. No? Omari's voice was steady. This is going to be handled in a different way. Finch didn't ask what he meant. He didn't have to, because the world was already watching. By the time Omari walked out of the airport doors, the video was already online. Miriam hadn't wasted a second. Within minutes, the footage had been uploaded, clipped, shared. The title? Racial Profiling at LAX. Officer Harasses Innocent Man. It was already gaining traction. Omari barely had time to take a breath before his phone started vibrating. A text from his business partner. This is blowing up, man. You good? Then, a call. A journalist from a major news outlet. They wanted a statement. Omari let out a slow breath. He hadn't planned for this. He had only wanted to get home. But now, this was bigger than him. Miriam walked beside him as they headed toward the pickup area. She checked her phone. The clip's at 50,000 views already, she said. A pause. Give it a few hours and it'll hit 6 figures. Omari ran a hand over his face. I didn't even do anything. Miriam glanced at him. That's exactly why people are mad. She wasn't wrong. The comments were already rolling in. This is why we need accountability in law enforcement. How many times has he done this before and gotten away with it? Props to the guy for keeping his cool. I wouldn't have. Fire him. Period. Omari exhaled sharply. He wasn't the first person this had happened to. The only difference this time? People saw it. Meanwhile, Kearney was drowning. Within the hour, the police department issued a statement. They called the incident deeply concerning, promised a full internal review. But that wasn't enough to stop the outrage. Reporters started digging. By morning, someone found 2 prior complaints against Kearney. Excessive force, both swept under the rug, but not anymore. Now they were back in the light. Omari's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Some wanted an interview. Others wanted a lawsuit. Civil rights groups were already drafting statements. And then, the real fallout. By midday, Officer Grant Kearney was suspended, pending investigation. Omari stared at the headline on his screen, feeling, what? Relief? Satisfaction? Not really, because he knew what came next. The police union would fight for Kearney. Some news stations would try to spin it. People online would argue over what Omari should have done differently. And Kearney? He'd probably pop up in another department a few towns over. That's how it always went. Miriam sat across from him at the airport cafe, watching him carefully. You okay? Omari tapped his phone against the table, stared at the screen. A slow breath. This changes things. Miriam raised an eyebrow. How? Omari met her gaze. Because now I have to decide what to do next. A beat. The power wasn't just in the video. It was in the choice. And this time, he wasn't going to let it slip away. Omari sat in his car staring at his phone. The news had moved fast. Faster than he expected. His name was everywhere now. His face, too. But this wasn't about him. Not really. He scrolled through his inbox. Messages flooding in. Some from old college friends. Some from strangers. People thanking him. Sharing their own stories. This happened to me last year at an airport in Phoenix. I filed a complaint and nothing came of it. My brother went through the same thing, but he wasn't as lucky. They arrested him for resisting. Thank you for standing your ground. We all see this too often. Omari let out a slow breath. He had options. An interview. A podcast. Maybe even legal action. But what would that change? He glanced out the window. Traffic crawled along Century Boulevard. The city kept moving, unbothered. Miriam's voice echoed in his mind. You handled that well. But had he? Or had he just survived it? His fingers hovered over the keyboard. Then he started typing. I wasn't looking for a fight today. I was just trying to get home. But that's the thing about moments like this. They remind you that staying silent won't stop it from happening again. This wasn't the first time, and it won't be the last. But maybe, just maybe, if we keep the cameras rolling, keep the pressure on, and keep demanding change, one day it will be. He hit post, and just like that. The story was no longer just his. It belonged to everyone watching, because awareness wasn't enough anymore. It was time for accountability. This happens more than we think, and too often the people on the receiving end don't have a platform to fight back. If you believe in holding those in power accountable, keep the conversations going, keep speaking up, keep demanding better. And if you've ever been in a situation like this, share your story, because the more we shine a light on injustice, the harder it becomes to ignore.